Hello, I'm Professor John Blakeman from the UW-Stevens Point Political Science Department, and I'd like to welcome you back to my ongoing lecture series on the U.S. Constitution, sponsored by the UWSP Alumni Association and their Alumni College Experience. So this is lecture number 4 in the series, and here I'll focus mainly on constitutional interpretation and just provide you with a very broad overview of some of the ways we've interpreted the Constitution over the past couple of hundred years, basically. And hopefully, this will give you some kind of insight to how we interpret, or how the Supreme Court interprets, the constitutional cases that we will focus on in detail later on in the series. Okay, let's get started. First off, remember the Constitution from the previous slide doesn't tell us how it's supposed to be interpreted. And we say the Constitution is not self-interpreting. It does not have a clause in it that tells us how we should read it. It's silent on who should interpret it and how it should be interpreted. Now, it's hard to say if the framers of the Constitution in 1788 thought about providing this type of guidance. You know, many of them were lawyers, not all of them, but many of them were, and they were well schooled in the English common law and legal interpretation. And it's highly likely that they saw the U.S. Constitution through that same lens, and that's fine. But we've been arguing for over 200 years about how the Constitution should be interpreted. So let's look at two main approaches, okay? One is what we call text and historical context. And this is where the text, the words of the document, are very, very important and are first and foremost in how we approach the Constitution. Historical context, this is where we focus on what we call original intent, the intent of the framers, the people who wrote the Constitution. Another approach is what we call in and beyond the text. This focuses on the idea that the U.S. Constitution is a living document, and it is interpreted by judges in their own specific political and social and economic era. We'll look at both of those. Now understand there are many other ways, perhaps, to interpret the Constitution. You know, we can interpret the U.S. Constitution through a feminist political perspective, through an economic perspective. And by that I mean we could interpret the Constitution as creating a free market society with minimal government regulation. Marxists have argued that there's a Marxist interpretation to the Constitution as well. I don't want to get into all of that. I'm just going to focus on these two because, you know, historically, these two are probably the most important. Now, when I approach this in class, I'm always quite clear to my students, you know, it's really up to you to pick one. And of course, students, you know, always say, well, they're somewhere in between. I guess that's okay. At the end of the day, we are probably all somewhere in between, I guess. So let's look at text and historical context first. And we start with what we might call textualism. We interpret the Constitution first by starting with the words of the document. That sort of makes sense. And we interpret the words in their natural or ordinary meaning. And this is sometimes called strict constructionism, that the words have a very grounded meaning, and we have to interpret the words of the document very strictly based on their meaning. This is all fine and good. You know, and it is it's a prominent way of interpreting the Constitution. It's a legitimate way of interpreting the Constitution. But we will encounter Supreme Court cases, for example, concerning the powers of Congress to regulate commerce, where we had to figure out, well, what is the natural or ordinary meaning of commerce? It's not as simple as you might think. And we also have, with text and historical context, what we call original intent. That we should interpret the U.S. Constitution based on what the framers intended with the words that they used. So, some of the pros to this approach to the U.S. Constitution. First off, it's faithful to the thought and intent of the framers. it pays historical fidelity to the people who wrote the Constitution. It confines the interpretation of the Constitution to what we call the four corners of the document, that we don't read beyond the Constitution. And from a practical perspective, it limits judicial power. If we tell judges that they have to interpret the Constitution based on the intent of the framers, based on the words, based on the four corners of the document, then it limits their power. And remember, federal judges are unelected. All right, now some of the cons, some of the drawbacks. Well, there's ongoing debate about who counts as a framer. A lot of people would say, hey, Thomas Jefferson, he's a framer of the Constitution. Yeah, you know, Thomas Jefferson was in Paris when the Constitution was written. Now, having said that, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison carried on a lengthy correspondence about what was going on in Philadelphia, and Jefferson's thoughts and ideas are arguably embedded within the Constitution. But yeah, we can argue about whether he's a framer or not. We have the people at the Constitutional Convention who debated it and wrote it. What about the states? You know, each of the states had to have its own constitutional convention to debate and ratify the U.S. Constitution. Does their intent matter too? Some people would say yes. I mean, because you had very bright people in those state constitutional conventions, like John Marshall, who goes on to become a Supreme Court justice. He was in the Virginia Ratification Convention. And some of his arguments coming out of the Virginia Convention, and then when he goes to serve in the House of Representatives from Virginia, in the U.S. House of Representatives, you know, he emerges as a very important figure in constitutional interpretation, but he wasn't necessarily a framer. So who counts? Now, what about the words? Now, a person who's really wedded to strict constructionism would say, well, we have to look at the 18th century meaning of those words. And you do encounter Supreme Court cases where a justice will refer to an 18th century dictionary to figure out what the word commerce means, or another word in the Constitution. Now, inflexibility. This is a drawback to original intent or strict constructionism. Critics would say the Constitution is not updated except through the amendment process. And remember, we've only amended the Constitution 27 times in over 200 years of political history. And that makes the Constitution very inflexible. It means it's not updated to fit our changing political, social, cultural, and economic needs. Now, a strict constructionist would say, that's fine. If you want to update the Constitution, amend it. I guess that's a fair argument. Okay, in and beyond the text, excuse me, or what we call the living Constitution. This focuses more on the underlying principles enshrined in the Constitution. Certainly the words matter, the text matters. But what matters more, as a living constitutionalist might say, would be the principles. So let's take Congress's power over interstate commerce. You might think it's boring, but it's actually really, really important. So the strict constructionist would say we have to figure out what commerce meant in the 18th century, and then what interstate commerce meant. Whereas the living constitutionalist would say, well, it's the principle at stake. It's not what commerce necessarily meant in the 18th century, the word itself. It's the principle that Congress can regulate commerce from one state to another. This is all tricky stuff. All right, so some of the pros. Well, the living constitution approach, it allows the Constitution to be flexible, to meet current and future and unknown political issues. And it doesn't confine the 18th century thinking or words. It doesn't confine us to those. that we can update the Constitution, its meaning, as we go. Some of the cons. Well, if we agree that the Constitution can be updated from one political era to another without amending it, that gives a lot of power to unelected judges. Well, you make up your own mind here. Whose interpretation matters the most in a given era? Judges, Congress, the presidency, interest groups? What underlying moral, economic, and political philosophies matter the most to interpreting the Constitution? If we're going to say that the Constitution is a living document and we update it as we go, then we are admitting that, well, it's grounded in the 18th century, but it's changing. And so as our political ideas evolve, as our economic thinking evolves, the meaning of the Constitution evolves as well. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. Like I said earlier, you all make up your own minds. Now, here's a couple of articles I'd encourage you to look at. Unfortunately, they're copywritten, and so I don't think I can place them in a public space for you all to access. But a classic original intent argument by Justice Antonin Scalia, one of my favorite Supreme Court justices. Originalism, the lesser evil. And Justice Scalia makes a very compelling argument about original intent and strict constructionism, especially as a way of limiting the power of federal judges. And Scalia says, that he subscribes to original intent, but he calls himself a faint-hearted originalist. He admits that when you get to the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment clause, for example, it's really, really tricky. Because when the Eighth Amendment was ratified in 1791, we still had public whipping, putting people in stocks, or thumb screws. Those were state criminal punishments. And Scalia says he doesn't agree with that. Now, Justice William Brennan, one of my favorite justices as well, he gives us a very compelling argument about the living Constitution approach. And he argues that he interprets the Constitution the only way he can, as a federal judge living and working in the 20th century. Both Justice Scalia and Justice Brennan are two of the most prominent Supreme Court justices in history. They served together, they disagreed, but they definitely liked each other, to say the least. Now, I encourage you to take a look at their writings because they're good and they give you both sides of the argument. If you're wondering where the American public stands, how about this? I love polls. I am, at the end of the day, a political scientist, to be sure. And so this is a poll from 2018. And it asks the question, it's done by the Pew Research Center, which is one of the better polling firms in the United States. And it simply asks a sampling of the American public how the Constitution should be interpreted. Meant as originally written or meant in current times? And the one thing I'll point out, so on the left here, you have people who respond, the Constitution should be interpreted as originally written. Sort of an original intent approach. Or it should be based on, our interpretation should be based on the current times. So about 55% of Americans in general might subscribe to the living Constitution approach. About 41% subscribe to original intent. Look how it breaks down upon age, though. 18 to 29-year-olds. 2/3 of them say the Constitution should be interpreted in current times as sort of a living Constitution. And it's only when you get to people who are 50 to 64 where we start to see public opinion pretty much split down the middle, and then people who are 65 and older who clearly gravitate, well, 51%, I should say, to original intent. So it's interesting how age affects your view of constitutional interpretation. There's no question that if you your political identification affects how you view the Constitution and interpretation. So if you're Republican, if you identify as Republican or you lean Republican, 2/3 of you say, yeah, constitutional interpretation should be based on original intent. If you identify as a Democrat or you lean Democrat, 3 out of 4 of you say, no, the Constitution should be interpreted in current times, the living Constitution approach. Your ideology, conservative, moderate to liberal, factors in here as well. But I'm always struck with age. You know how younger people tend to view the U.S. Constitution as a living document. Older people tend to gravitate to original intent. Age is always a factor.